let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the 7th Inclusive Solarize workshop today as part of the residential solar cohort, where we'll be getting into evaluating RFP responses in order to select an installer or installers. So as always, a reminder of where we are in the process here. We've gone through community partnerships, setting the goals for the campaign and addressing financial barriers, developing the RFP, which is pretty linked to today's workshop, setting up the campaign webpage, as well as communications and outreach. And today we're going to be really focusing on selecting an installer. So today is our second to last official workshop in the cohort, and a reminder that that last section from April to August for campaign management will be holding just kind of informal office hours, but no formal workshops. So today is our second to last workshop, with our last workshop 3 weeks from today on the campaign launch. Okay, so we have two desired outcomes today for participants. First is to understand the installer selection process and have the necessary resources to select a campaign installer. And second, address any liability concerns and legal considerations around which organization or individuals are selecting the installer. And these two outcomes is how we framed our workshop today. So with our agenda, as always, we'll spend about 10 minutes just in breakout rooms to get to know each other and answer a check-in question. And I'll frame the conversation for today by providing an overview of the installer selection process that can be broadly applicable, but the majority of the time is really going to be getting into those two objectives in an expert panel. So we have a couple of recurring expert speakers today: Philadelphia Energy Authority, Solar Source, Spark Northwest, and Solar United Neighbors. And we'll have two expert panels in there to really get at those objectives of understanding the process and legal considerations. And the last half hour or so, as usual, will be for community-specific breakouts for your specific campaign. And just a note that today, since Solar United Neighbors installer selection process is a bit unique, we'll actually be having all cities that are working with Solar United Neighbors in one specific breakout. And then lastly, we'll just talk about next steps. So I'm gonna share my screen again, and as I said, provide a little bit of just a level setting with the installer selection process, and then the majority of the time will be for Q&A with our experts. So now I'll go ahead and jump in. So really the installer selection process can be broken down into 3 steps, and these 3 steps is what I'll cover in the next 15 minutes. So the first is to, of course, determine the selection committee. The second is to aggregate the RFP responses and then evaluate them accordingly. And lastly, communicate those decisions with the proposals. So I'm going to focus on all 3 of these, but the majority of the time on that second piece. So first, with choosing a selection committee. So you'll want the selection committee to represent the priorities of who's going to be participating in the campaign. And that's going to be obviously different depending on what your campaign goals and outreach strategy is. This could look like city officials. There were a couple in our check-in question, a couple people said, you know, someone from the sustainability office or someone like that. So you could have a city official on that selection committee, a community organization, or a specific community leader. That was also mentioned, and which makes sense. These first 2 are kind of part of the core team of the Solarize or solar co-op campaigns. You could also have current or previous program participants helping out in this selection that have installed solar or are going to install solar through this process. And this is where Solar United Neighbors can really speak to this. This is their primary avenue of selecting the installers, actually using the current participants in the campaign. And Corey can speak to that a little bit later. And then lastly, some type of technical expert that can just be the technical expert to evaluate those proposals. So check any backgrounds, aggregate the responses together, and just kind of facilitate the discussion and provide that technical expertise necessary. So then second, on aggregating responses, you'll want to aggregate responses by the evaluation criteria that are specified in your RFP in order to evaluate and score them accordingly. So instead of going, one installer at a time and scoring them, you'll want to organize the responses in categories of the evaluation criteria. And our team developed a template that we've called the RFP response aggregation and evaluation template to help in this process. So this template is really based off the response form template that we created and that we mentioned in the 4th workshop on developing and issuing the RFP for installers to put all of their information in a response form. This template is based off that. So it does 2 primary objectives. The first is to score the responses. So just directing your attention to the bottom of the screen, there's the scoring summary tab in blue. So that's one part, and I'll get to that. And then the rest are the actual aggregation of responses. So each tab is associated with one of the evaluation criteria and the questions that you asked for that. So I'm just going to quickly click through a couple of these to dive into this. So this first tab on the scoring summary, this is just a simple evaluation matrix where the installers' names will be automatically populated when you copy and paste their responses in. And after you determine the points that are listed in the RFP for each evaluation criteria, you can go by selection criteria to evaluate them accordingly. And each of those evaluation criteria can have an associated tab. So for example, the installer profile, that might speak to the installer experience that you'll want to evaluate. You'll have this template has a specific tab for that. So just getting to this first tab here, so what I just highlighted on the left side of the screen there, these are the questions that were in our RFP response form template, so that all you'll have to do is for each proposer, so for proposer number 1, just copy and paste their responses into that column, and then do the same thing for proposer 2 and onward with how many installers responded to your RFP. And this just helps to have all of the information associated with installer experience or profile in one place. And the same thing can be done on pricing. So again, it's the questions on the left that you asked and their responses on the right if you're using a response form template. But the other thing I was just going to highlight lastly in this template, I'm not going to go through each tab, but at the bottom of each proposer's information, it helps to just summarize your initial feedback. So for proposer number 1 on pricing, how would you summarize their response in comparison to the other proposals? And having these summaries at the bottom for every evaluation criteria makes that process a lot easier. So I just wanted to highlight that template that we created. If you're using the response form template that we created, this will be super useful. Even if you've modified it in any way, you can also modify this one accordingly. So that was a little bit of information on how to aggregate responses together into one file. Now I'm going to get into actually evaluating responses, and how I wanted to do this was actually let the participants in this workshop practice with using the Zoom annotate feature to score kind of some dummy installer responses. So I've just chosen 4 potential evaluation criteria categories: installer experience, price proposal, additional offerings, and community benefits. And I have some example kind of information for 2 potential installers. And what I'd like you to do, and I think the instructions, if you haven't used Zoom Annotate before, should be in the chat, but use Zoom Annotate to place a heart on the scoring spectrum for each category. So for example, in this first one, we have installer experience. So for both installer number 1, who has 10 years of experience and has worked with 10 local projects, place your heart on that spectrum from 1 to 10, 10 being the most points. And then the same for installer 2, who has completed 20 years of experience and 50 local projects in the last year. So how would you score those 2 proposals on installer experience? And then we'll do the same thing after I give everyone a little bit of time, and we'll walk through the other 3. So far, it seems like installer number 2, of course, is getting a little bit of a higher ranking for experience. Overall, more years of experience and more local experience with local projects. And I'm keeping track because I'm going to sum these at the end, but it looks like maybe like a 6 for installer number 1 and maybe like a 8 for installer number 2. So the second one we have here is on price. So let's say that installer number 1 is offering $2.20 a watt, which is 20% off kind of the going market rate, and offers some financing. And installer number 2 is just offering a pretty small kind of 5% off the market rate discount and is not offering financing. I also took the liberty of saying that this would be worth 20 points. But of course, each campaign will want to associate different weighting and points for each. So I'll give a little bit of time for you all to see where you would score each of these installers. It looks like installer number 1 is, let's say, maybe in the 15 points category out of 20, and installer number 2 seems to be coming in maybe around 5. Okay, so then for additional offerings, let's say installer number 1 can offer electrical upgrades related to the PV system, and installer number 2 can also do that, but installer number 2 also offers roof repair or has a subcontractor for roof repair, as well as energy efficiency offerings. And I've taken the liberty of saying that this would be worth 10 points, but feel free to score those installers as well. So it looks like installer number 1 maybe is again, maybe around like the 7 points, and number 2 around 8. Or sorry, installer number 1 around 3 points. Make sure I'm writing these down right. And then lastly, on community benefits, let's say installer number 1 is regional, and they're interested in maybe donating just 1 installation. And then installer number 2 is a local installer who is doing some job training and hires from the local community. I have stated that this would maybe be worth 10 points, so feel free to score that accordingly. And it looks like installer number 1 might be around the 6 points, let's say, threshold, and number 2, we'll say 8. So I'm going to do some super quick mental math here. Installer number 2 looks like they have 29 points out of 50, and installer number 1 looks like they have, man, that's close, 30 points. So hopefully this was an interesting exercise to see, kind of given the exercise we went through, installer number 1 would actually win out with 30 points, and installer number 2 would not with 29, based on price having more of a weighting. So hopefully that just kind of gets you starting to think on the importance of the weight that you put on each evaluation, and how you might, each evaluation criteria, and how you might evaluate them accordingly. All right, so now I'm going to ask for Tushar to clear the screen of all of these wonderful hearts. Thank you. And it looks like we got one more maybe coming in, and then great. So I'm going to move onto this next slide, which is still related to the evaluation process. So let's say that you have 10 proposals, and you're really unsure on whether you should select 1 installer or maybe 2. So choosing this decision is really based on the expected volume of your campaign, and the proposal quality of each of the campaigns, and the goals of your campaign. So I'm going to quickly walk through some advantages and disadvantages of just having a single installer or multiple installers. So with a single installer, it's simpler to coordinate. You have a single pricing structure that you're communicating. You're only working with 1 installer, so that's just easier to work with, as well as uniform experience for all participants in the campaign and the same quality. But some of the disadvantages is that there could be the potential for a backlog of installation depending on the volume that each installer can handle, as well as fewer options for participants and less opportunity for installers. So some installers might be feeling left out if only 1 installer is doing all the installations. For multiple installers, it's really just kind of the advantages are the opposite of the disadvantages for a single installer. So multiple installers can manage a high number of participants. There's more choice for participants, and more installers can benefit. And similarly, the disadvantages is that the coordination is more complex, potentially a lower solar discount if you're working with multiple installers, and potentially uneven customer experiences. So this is just something to think about, especially if you haven't yet issued your RFP, is to make sure that in your RFP you're asking, what volume can you as an installer handle, and compare that to the expected number of participants in your campaign, because that's an important consideration to make on whether you need one or multiple installers, as well as what's the overall goal of your campaign, and do you have the capacity to work with multiple installers or a single installer. And I know that in the panel discussion, we can definitely get into the experiences of some of our experts, which I think have leaned a little bit more towards a single installer, but we can get into more of the specifics in a minute. So my last slide is just briefly on the communication aspect here. So you'll want to communicate the evaluation decision and process to all proposers, as well as offering constructive feedback to those that are not selected. So of course, with the selected installer, communicate that decision, but make sure that the selected installer is meeting the necessary conditions in whatever agreement that's being signed. But potentially, even more importantly, for the other installers, you'll still want to communicate with them to offer thanks and constructive feedback on their proposals. And the second point here, I think, is important to communicate the campaign's broader impact on the local solar industry. So sometimes Solarize campaigns can upset certain installers. If they're not selected, they might feel like they're getting left out of a good opportunity, but really the goal of this effort is to accelerate broader local solar adoption and that contagion impact to help all installers in the community. And hopefully, with multiple rounds of Solarize campaigns, different installers can also be selected and help benefit from this effort. Now we're going to have the expert panel that Tushar is going to lead us through with some of our experts. So this is just a reminder of who we have for experts today. We have Linda Irving from Spark Northwest, Corey Ramsden from Solar United Neighbors, Mavish Ilyas from Philadelphia Energy Authority, and Don Moreland from Solar Crowdsource. So I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Tushar, who's going to take us through or who's going to help facilitate that discussion.
Thanks, Ryan. So as Ryan mentioned, we have a larger chunk of time for discussion today, and the plan right now is to have the panel roughly split into two different sections. So we're going to begin with a discussion on the general installer selection process. We'll probably have a quick break then, and then we'll regroup to talk more about the legal considerations and liability around selecting an installer. But we'll also kind of see how the discussion goes and shape it around that. So I'm going to be starting us off with, just asking kind of a question to each of our four experts. But just a reminder, as Ryan posted in the chat, that we're going to have hopefully quite a bit of time for questions. So start putting your questions in the chat and I can read them out, or we can just have time for you to unmute yourself. But let's maybe start with Linda. Okay, I can see you, Linda, great. So actually, I'm going to ask this question of all the four panelists, and we can start with Linda. But the question's really, could you just start by talking about generally how your campaigns choose installers? How do you choose the selection committees? And are there techniques that you've used to make the RFP information easier to understand and compare?
Yeah, thanks. I'm Linda Irvine at Spark Northwest, and I just want to clarify that we are a nonprofit that works on Solarize campaigns in partnership with cities. So we're not cities ourselves, but I'm going to try to tailor my answer to the experience that I've had from the point of view of the cities that have worked with us to do this process. So it's really exciting to see so many people interested in Solarize. On choosing a selection committee to select the installer, we would typically work with a community group like a neighborhood association or a local chapter of the Sierra Club, or interested volunteers, and the city staff who were coordinating the Solarize campaign would put out a request for volunteers through the city channels. If you're interested in solar, contact so-and-so at the city. And then they would seek to put together a team of no more than 6, but no less than 4. So 4 to 6 people that reflected what you had already spoken about, Ryan. Maybe someone who's gone solar before, someone who's really interested in going solar this time, so they know they want to participate, someone with a little bit of technical background. We at Spark Northwest would bring that technical expertise, and we would be non-voting members of the committee, as well as the city official who was the coordinator would also be a non-voting member of the committee. So the only voting members were the community volunteers that raised their hand to say, yeah, I want to be involved in this campaign. And I think the city's role was really to get the word out that we were looking for volunteers. And of course, it was most effective when we could use existing organizations that had already had interest in the Solarize campaign. Like in Portland, it was the Southeast Uplift Neighborhood Association that really took the lead, and they found the volunteers to be in that committee. As far as making the RFP and the scoring easy to follow, I think you're doing a great job by having a rubric, and it's really important that your request for proposals sections match your scoring rubric sections, so that as you showed Ryan, you can just copy answers and paste it into a rubric. And the other reason, I'm a little bit, you go through all this sort of eye-watering, mind-bending work to create a rubric, and it looks like a lot. If you don't like Excel, it's horrible, but you need a transparent paper trail of how you made your decision. And in the end, you're going to be interviewing people and selecting the contractor that's going to work contractors that work closely with you, that align with your goals, but you need that transparent paper trail of how you made your decision. I'll stop there. I could talk for hours, so I should just mute me.
Oh, great. Thanks, Linda. That's actually really helpful that you partner with neighborhood associations, and maybe you provide that technical expertise yourself to really break down the RFP information. And those two are really key. Let's maybe go to Corey next, because I think Sun has kind of a similar process in that they're like the technical expertise. But Corey, could you talk more about your general installer selection process? And I know you have a slide too, so feel free to share.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Thank you. And we, as Linda mentioned, our process is somewhat similar in that since we're aggregating community members, and they're really the ones driving the process in terms of what they're saying that they're interested in. We reflect that back during the selection committee and seek volunteers to participate. So that might be, our group sizes range anywhere from probably 30 to 150 people, sometimes a little larger. And when we solicit volunteers, we're doing that in a couple different ways. We're doing it when they sign up, just to see if there's interest at the outset. And then we're following up with the group as a whole before selection to see who's interested. And that generally creates a selection committee volunteer group of about 5 to 10 people, roughly. And they're committing, what we're sharing with them is that they're committing to spend roughly 2 to 3 hours together, plus a little bit of preparation time ahead of time to sit down and review all these bids. Again, with our support, similar to Spark Northwest, to facilitate the conversation and to provide technical support and answer questions. But we're not voting or making the selection. They're all the ones that are doing that. And that process typically is a consensus-driven process, although it's up to the committee. I've certainly seen groups come up with scoring methods on their own. Some people come much more prepared than others, but generally speaking, they're discussing each of the categories and then reaching a decision after somewhere between 2 and 3 hours. What we do to help that happen is prepare. I like to think of the process really in sort of 3 sections. One is setting up for success to how to do this, and we do that through checking all the bids ahead of time and preparing them, and summarizing that information for installers, for the selection committee, and then doing the organizing part of it. So making it easier for people to sign up, sharing that information. Right now, they're all Google Docs that we share amongst the group. as well as preparing them so that they can review that information. So that's sort of the, the key beginning part. In that, and during the meeting itself, is the second part of the meeting dynamics, is making sure we're facilitating. So more broadly speaking, thinking about who's running that meeting and who's going to resolve discussions and conflicts, making sure everyone's heard. That's a role that we play. And then ultimately helping them figure out the best path for them to decide how they're going to pick, and us documenting and sort of keeping track of that. And then the last part is the follow-up, which we're doing with the installers and sort of making sure that everyone gets feedback that we can share in a way that helps them build their business, as well as supports their interest, hopefully, in participating in future groups. The last thing you want is a scenario where you've got one installer that's winning all the time and everyone else sort of stops bidding. So you want to build that market. You want to make sure the installers see that it's worth their time, and that they learn from the experience as well, in addition to the market, hopefully, that we're creating by building this demand. So that's sort of of what we're doing as a group overall. I think some of the things for people to think about when you're organizing is just, especially in the meeting itself, is just keeping a clear eye of how much time you have, making sure you're using participants' time effectively. And we do that to some degree by what we call time boxing, which is just making sure that you're giving people expectations of how much time they're spending on each section, because it can be a lot of information, and just being patient with people and answering questions and trying to sort of direct the conversation towards a decision. And those are some of the dynamics we deal with because we're working with the general public. And I'll stop there. Happy to answer other questions about our process.
Cool. Thanks, Corey. Let's shift now to, Corey and Linda kind of described maybe a more community-focused approach. Maybe let's shift to Mavish, and I would love to hear more about how PEA selects the installer, whether that's very community-centric as well, or is it just the agency doing it in a slightly different way?
Sure. Thank you so much, Tushar, and thank you for having me on the panel. I know that some of you know me already, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Mavish, and I am the Solar Projects Coordinator with the Philadelphia Energy Authority. And as always, really excited to be here. So Philadelphia Energy Authority is an independent municipal agency, and we can procure on our own without going through the city's procurement process. What this means is that we can release the RFP, review the responses, and select the installers on our own. And having this autonomy has really helped us. So when we launched the program in 2017 for phase 1, we engaged consultants to partner with us and to be on board with us as a part of the selection committee. But since then, we have been reviewing the responses internally with the help of a robust and a streamlined selection criteria framework, and I'll be talking about that in a minute. But I think, like Ryan mentioned, it's really important to have a standardized RFP response form. So we attach that form with the RFP, and we ask all the applicants to submit the responses using that form. And having a standardized structure really helps us aggregate and summarize all the information and sort of compare it across different applicants. I think it's also important to mention that just for the sake of transparency, you can talk about the selection criteria and the timeline in the document, so that if the installers have any questions, they can ask you before they submit the responses, if you're allowing them some time to submit those questions, and if you have the capacity and the ability to provide responses. So I can now shift the focus and talk about the selection criteria and the process that we follow here at the Philadelphia Energy Authority. So like I mentioned, all of the process is done internally. So overall, we look at the quality of the proposal, and we also look at the installer's experience in terms of their ability to develop, design, and install commercial and residential PV systems. We also ask the applicants to submit a list of installs, and from that list, we randomly select a few projects. And for that projects, we conduct an on-site quality assurance assessment, which means that we partner with a third-party inspector who goes on site on the installation site to inspect the system and to make sure that the system was installed in accordance to all the guidelines and electrical codes. So that practice has been really helpful just to make sure that the installers that we are shortlisting for the program are able to provide installs that follow all the codes and standards. In addition to that, I think a really important criteria is the assessment of value offered by the pricing of proposed equipment. And make sure you also talk about the adders and price escalators, because sometimes installers would quote a price, but they wouldn't talk about the adders, or they wouldn't talk about how the price would escalate over the years. And then we also ask for the terms and conditions for different financing options. And this includes the cash purchase, the loan, the lease, the PPA. And also it's really important to ask for those of you who are focused, and you're trying to develop your market for LMI households, ask if they have a product or if they're willing to serve that segment of the market. In addition to that, it's also really important to make sure that the installers are able to provide quality customer service. So if a customer reaches out to the installer that you've selected and they're not, getting back to the customers, and it's been like 5 business days or 7 business days, that would affect your campaign, right? So one way just to get a sense of how the installers respond to customer questions and, generally their practices is that you can ask for customer references, and you can also ask for the communication materials that they use for their sale processes, or you can ask for a copy of the customer contract, just to make sure that they're appropriate consumer protections embedded in the contract. I know that Ryan talked about the implementation capacity, which is also one of the selection criteria components that is in our framework. So for example, if you're projecting that you will be sending 10 leads to an installer, you need to make sure that they have the capacity and the staff to process those leads. And if not, you may consider hiring more than one installer. And just don't think about the sales process, also think about what happens after the sale has completed or after the contract has been signed. Do they have the installation crew to complete all the projects? What is your target? How many megawatts are you trying to achieve or install within this year or next year? And also make sure they have services or department that is able to follow up with the customers once the install has happened, so that the customers are able to reach out to them if they have a question regarding monitoring of the system or maintenance. And then we have certain other aspects in terms of making sure that the installers are financially capable of running the program through the phase this year or next year, whatever the timeline looks like. We also look at the licensing documents and the insurances to make sure that they are able to work in the state and the city. And then, you can always modify the criteria to make sure it aligns with your organizational goals. So at PEA, a big goal for us is to create jobs. We have a goal of creating 10,000 clean energy jobs by 2026. So we also asked the installer, what is your potential for growth? Can you talk about your diverse business and local hiring plan in the RFP? And then given the current context, you can also ask about the COVID-19 preparedness, including workplace safety training, and what are some of the processes and procedures that they follow. And I also wanted to mention that after reviewing and summarizing all the responses, we typically also conduct interviews with installers, just to meet with the team and learn more about the processes. So yeah, that is a summary of what we do, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Mavish. Just kind of echoing a few things that you said. You mentioned it's really, really important to have a response form, and just a plug that we definitely drew a lot from PEA and Solar United Neighbors and Solar Crowdsource in coming up with our response form template. And as Linda mentioned, we've definitely done, we've really aligned our response form template with the selection criteria. So those are really important points. And I also wanted to highlight what you mentioned about doing on-site quality assurance testing if your campaign has time and capacity, or at least doing customer reviews, which I think is something that Sun does as well. But let's move to Don now that you're back, Don. The question that everyone else was just answering was, could you just maybe talk a bit about how your campaigns choose installers? How do you choose the selection committee, and are there techniques to make that selection process easier, to simplify the RFP information, et cetera?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for having me, and pleasure to participate in this workshop. Yeah, I'll kind of echo a lot of what's already been said, but I'll try to start from the top. And that is just as far as the selection committee is concerned, we want to have as many folks involved as we can. If you have a good cross section of the community, then you're going to get a lot of good feedback on the RFP and have the best possible outcome. The way we organize our campaigns is all the community partners will dedicate at least one person toward the steering committee that will help manage the campaign, and then from that steering committee we'll ask for volunteers who will participate in the RFP process. That our RFP process, as we were talking about in the breakout session, it can be a heavy lift. It's a commitment, and it does take time. It's a very front-loaded process. So once you get past the RFP, then it's a lot smoother after that. But there is a good 30-45 days of constant meeting and going through versions of the RFP, and then getting the RFP out there as far and as wide as you possibly can, and then getting the bids in. And we do a lot what has already been said. We have the selection criteria, and we weigh that selection criteria based on feedback from the community. So there is no standard really way to weigh those selection criteria. Some communities will favor pricing more than quality of equipment, or some will favor contractor experience, for example. So that's really where a lot of the input comes in drafting the RFP. And then we get the bids in, and we'll take a couple of days to evaluate those. We do provide a evaluation sheet for all the folks who are on the selection committee to be able to look at the selection criteria and give it a score. But then we also have a notes section by each selection criteria, because we want people that, as they're going through the RFP and they're looking at the selection criteria, that they're going to have some questions, and we want to make sure that they have a place to jot those questions down and save those for the interview. So Mavish mentioned the interview process, and I can't really stress enough how important that is, really, because you're going to be working with these folks for about 12 months, between the outreach portion of the campaign all the way through installation. You want to know who you're working with. They want to know who they're working with, and it's just real important from a cultural point of view, and from a just a general working point of view, to make sure that everybody knows who they're working with there. I want to add a couple of things that has already been kind of mentioned, but in addition to requesting from the contractors that we see a copy of their proposals that they send out, we really want to take a close look at those proposals. So what we do is we ask them to do a sample 5 kilowatt proposal. We want to see what, that we want to make sure that they're putting a degradation factor on the panel production. We want to make sure that they're not inflating the accelerator rate too much. And that's the rate at which the utility generally increases their rates year over year. That can be factored into the proposal, but you want it to be based on some kind of historic perspective. So we normally do about 2.5% annually. So if you look at a proposal and somebody's got a 5% annual escalation rate in there, then that's that's probably too high, depending on your utility, and it doesn't really reflect an accurate representation of the performance of the solar. We also ask for their actual contract that they enter into with the customer. Like Mavish alluded to, we also ask for, any of those financing agreements. We want to see the spec sheets for the materials. That's really important too, because we did have a campaign a little while ago. I don't know if you're familiar with Enphase, the microinverters, but in the proposal, they said that they're IQ7 pluses, but their spec sheet was an IQ7. And there's a big difference between an IQ7 and an IQ7 plus, without getting into too much detail. So, just to make sure that everything that they have represented is truly a part of that, evaluation. And then finally, going back to the interview, we usually provide about 45 minutes for that interview process. We want the contractors to introduce themselves. We'll go around the room and introduce ourselves, and then we'll get straight into it. Questions about the RFP. We'll allow everyone on the selection committee to have an opportunity to ask their questions and get those responses and jot those down. And generally, 45 minutes is enough time. Sometimes they'll spill over. And then there have been times where the bid is not complete, or something they said during the interview wasn't consistent with what their bid said. So in some cases, we do give folks about 24 to 48 hours to provide supplements to their bid, depending on the situation. So that's another thing to consider. And usually you won't get that opportunity if you don't have that interview process. And then, finally, we'll just, we get together, we have our scoring sheet, just like what Ryan went over. And we look at that scoring sheet, we'll add up those numbers. But, I'll say that the scoring sheet is very informative, and we go by the scoring sheet, probably, most of the time, I should say, but there are intangible factors that you can't you can't quantify. And so that's really important to get that selection committee back together. You look at the scores, put them up on the board, and then you have a discussion, and a really honest discussion about the pros and cons of each and what makes sense for your community.
Great. Thanks, Don. Yeah, I think that two of the things that you mentioned, one, having really inspecting the proposal and the contract is something that we took your suggestion. I think Corey also mentioned it in a previous workshop, and we definitely added that to our RFP. So if folks haven't put out their RFP yet, that's definitely really an important thing to do. And then, yeah, also thanks for stressing the importance of the interviews as well. I definitely have some more questions that I can ask, but I want to first open it up. I saw that Christopher asked a few questions in the chat. So maybe Christopher, you could, if any of your questions haven't been answered, feel free to ask those. And then if anyone else has questions, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself as well. Okay.
I guess I think I know the answer to this, but just wanted to make sure. It seems like you'd want to finalize the scoring template or the scoring rubric ahead of time. Is that right? Yeah, because otherwise you could just kind of retrofit it to meet a certain installer's qualifications. And then I'm just wondering, for maybe this is more for you, Mavish. So since Salt Lake City would be, issuing this RFP, making the selection, I'm just, and actually somebody in our purchasing department, I'm sure would know the answer to this, but I'm just wondering, we've got very strong Freedom of Information Act type laws. And so I'm just wondering, can those scoring sheets be requested by members of the public and viewed? Do you deal with that at all?
That is a great question, Christopher. So I know that transparency is really important, even for us as a municipal agency, but I can ask my team to see if this is something we have encountered in the past, and we can coordinate offline. I can get that answer for you.
Thank you so much.
Not a problem. And then just one more thing that I wanted to add, echoing what Don said, it's really important to review the spec sheet, the customer proposal, and the contract. And it's always a good practice to attach a list of all the required documents with the RFP, so the installer is submitted as one consolidated proposal.
Thanks. So yeah, I just want to, again, I definitely have some more questions and can continue the conversation, but also know we're actually close to time, but I want to, yeah, if anyone else has questions or wants to unmute themselves or put it in the chat, let me know. Otherwise,
I just wanted to respond to Christopher's question about the city issuing the RFP. In the campaigns that we run, the city actually doesn't issue the RFP. It's either Spark Northwest or the community group, like the neighborhood association. And it's really clear that the city is involved as a facilitator, but we're selecting a featured contractor. We're not hiring anyone. We are selecting the contractor that will be featured throughout the education and outreach of this Solarize campaign. And participants in the campaign can take advantage of this very transparent and group discount pricing, or they can go get another bid from some other contractor. And that to Ryan's point, that this really does benefit the solar ecosystem of the entire community. It's not just the featured contractor that will be benefiting from this.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that kind of goes into the legal considerations and liability discussion that we'll get more into maybe after the break. So how about let's take a short break and then we can follow up kind of right where Linda left off in about 5 minutes. Echoing what Ryan said before the break, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If you have questions from the discussion we were just having, that's totally fine too. You can put them in the chat or unmute yourself, and we'll definitely get to them or try to. And but maybe to start off where we were, let's shift more into a conversation kind of about the legal considerations and liability involved with selecting an installer. We know that that's a concern that a number of the cities on the call expressed. So we wanted to spend some time specifically on that topic. And maybe we can start with you, Linda, since you had kind of touched on that a little bit. I think what you mentioned about talking about a featured installer versus a selected installer makes a lot of sense. And you also mentioned that you typically have an MOU. So could you talk more about how you do that?
Yeah, so we typically, once the installer is selected, and we sometimes select one installer, sometimes two. When we do select two, we ask that they partner to agree on a pricing structure, so that we actually had some installers who partnered. There was a veteran installer and a new installer. They partnered and they got shirts that had the logo of both companies on the shirts. I mean, it was really amazing to see these installers working together. But we sign an MOU between Spark Northwest, the community organization, and the installer, just laying out our goals and the roles and responsibilities. And one thing we ask of the installers is to include in their contract with the homeowner the phrase that Spark Northwest, the city, and the community group are not party to this contract at all. It is only a contract between the solar installer and the homeowner. So I don't actually know if we've enforced that, but we've made it really clear that the city and Spark Northwest are not a party to end. The only contracts that are happening are contracts between the homeowner and the solar installer. And the memorandum of understanding is just where we lay out those expectations and make it clear that we're not party to that contract.
Cool. That makes a lot of sense. Just making it very clear that the city is not hiring the installer in any way.
I just had one other thought. This was when we have worked with utilities as well. They've hired us to do Solarize, and one of our utility liaisons, her line was, look, we've selected an installer, and in return for selection, that installer is being absolutely transparent about their pricing. Every other installer does not have to be transparent about their pricing because they weren't selected. So there's like pros and cons to being selected, right? So that was just another attempt to say there's advantages and disadvantages. We've selected a featured installer, and that featured installer is going to be attending workshops, helping with outreach, really investing a lot of time and effort in this. And oh, I just saw a question. We have anywhere from 0 customers to 185 customers. I mean, hot installations. And a typical campaign would reach between 200 and 500 attendees at a workshop.
Great. Let's move to Dawn. So I imagine, Dawn, that you're in a similar situation where you're often partnering with cities, but not having them have any formal agreement with the installer. So could you talk more about how you address legal considerations and liability?
Yeah, sure. There are, I want to back up just for a second, because among the coalition partners, we normally do enter into a memorandum of understanding that kind of outlines the roles and responsibilities of the different coalition partners, and what kind of commitments they're making. And I don't know if it's really that enforceable. It's a memorandum of understanding, but it does serve as a way to kind of get everything down on a piece of paper so everybody can agree on a set of principles for the management of the campaign. And like Linda mentioned, all those events, who's kind of taking the responsibility for putting those on and getting the word out and things like that. So that's one agreement. The other agreement is the contractor agreement. And so the way that normally works is that Solar Crowdsource will kind of stand in as the legal representative on behalf of the coalition. But in the RFP and in that agreement itself, we make sure that we have a lot of hold harmless and indemnification language, so as to make it clear that none of the coalition members are responsible for anything that might happen due to negligence or neglect or intentional conduct, things like that. So it's really important, I think, to have that in there. But we also make it clear that the agreement between, just like Linda mentioned, the agreement is between the, let me get back to that. So the agreement that Solar Crowdsource will enter into with the contractor, it also includes as exhibits. In the first exhibit, it'll include the RFP itself. And then the second exhibit will include the actual bid from the contractor. So that way, all the representations that the community has made and all the representations that the contractor has made are part of that agreement. And you don't have to go back and kind of repeat all of that information in the agreement itself. That way you can actually streamline that agreement with the contractor and focus on the commitments that they have to make in order to perform the services that they promised to do in the RFP. I think having those two exhibits as part of the agreement is a big way to kind of hold everybody to the terms and the spirit of the entire campaign. One final thing that we do, we request insurance requirements, and we ask that the contractor make Solar Crowdsource a loss payee on on that insurance policy. So, you know, we've never had anything happen, but in case of an eventuality, you know, we don't have to go back and try to redo something that we should have done in the first place. So I think between the indemnifications, the hold harmless, including those exhibits, and getting you know, that insurance part of it, those are really good ways to mitigate any risk if there might be to the city or to any of the other coalition partners. And then also, what I was going to mention before is just the agreement between the contractor and the actual homeowner or the business owner. It is really important that in the contract it states that they have an opportunity to get evaluations from other contractors, that, you know, although this contractor is working exclusively with this campaign, that you know, that they're obviously free to go get bids and contract with anybody they want. So we want to make that part of it really clear, and that the agreement is between the contractor and the customer. So and when you structure it that way, we really, the coalition and the community really serves as a backstop in case anything should go sideways with the contract. And I think a lot of people feel really good about that in a Solarize campaign. They're not going it alone. And you know, they have a whole bunch of people in the community that are there to help out.
And Don, just for clarification, so are those are exhibits that you ask for in the RFP, is that right?
No, so the first exhibit is the RFP itself,
right,
which is a 19-page document, but we just attach it to the agreement as an exhibit. The second exhibit is the contractor's bid itself, which can be 50 pages. When you take their actual response and then all of their attachments, like their contracts and spec sheets and everything, then that is another exhibit. And we attach it to the agreement itself. The agreement itself is only about 7 or 8 pages. It's rather straightforward agreement, because you've got all that other stuff as exhibits, and it's just we have found it is a good way to try to streamline that contract process.
Glad I asked. Maybe everyone else understood, but I clearly didn't. Okay, let's maybe ask Corey next for thoughts. Corey, I know Sun often works with cities, but sometimes doesn't, and so maybe if you could talk both about, you know, how you think about liability both for your city partners, but also, you know, for yourself as an organization when you're working on these campaigns.
Yeah, thank you. As you said, we don't always work with cities, although they are often a partner of ours. I put something in the chat here if folks want to look at it. We have individual co-op members have a signing agreement when they join the group, which essentially states a lot of what's already been relayed here by others, just to make it clear that we're an interested third party, and that we're facilitating discounted access and clear, transparent access to pricing as part of the group dynamic. But ultimately, that those contracts are signed between them and the installer directly. We typically don't include any of the partner language or indemnification for partners on here, just because there is no real relationship there. They're essentially promoting the group, but they're not directly involved in running the program, which frankly often is an advantage and a positive thing for our partners, because they have that sort of air gap there, and they're free to do what they're comfortable doing, which is talking to the people in their community about the opportunity, and they don't have to worry about any of the the nuts and bolts on the back end, which is what we're doing. We do also have an agreement we sign with the contractor who gets selected that just very clearly lays out what we expect of them and when they're providing the service to people who are engaging with them through the group, in terms of the clarity of what they're offering and that it matches their bid. Any of the details related to response times with us and with co-op members, so that's all clear. And that is our primary way of creating a legal arrangement that gives us at least some leverage to be able to make sure they're doing what they say they're going to do, but also just to make clear expectations on all ends about when the engagement starts, when it finishes, and what's required of them and of us. So those things, we've never had an issue with any of that. I think our biggest issue sometimes are installers maybe not paying the referral fee that we collect when someone signs a contract, but that's that's always the case in some situations. And all of that is also clearly stated, and we make that clear both for somebody who's joining the group up front, but also to the contractor, that those fees are standard and they don't privilege any particular group from being selected or not selected. So that's important to sort of make all that clear at the beginning. I think that's probably the only thing I wanted to mention there. I think everyone else has covered a lot of the stuff that I would have mentioned.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, I do see a question in the chat, so maybe we could maybe I'll ask Mavish for her take on how PEA thinks about legal considerations and liability, considering that you are a public agency and doing it directly, and then we can get to Christian's question.
Thanks, Tushar. So I think Linda, Don, and Corey did an excellent job of summarizing the most important aspects. So Philadelphia Energy Authority, we actually sign a contract with the selected installers. So it's not an MOU, it's a contract. And then in the contract, we have an indemnification clause that releases us of all the liabilities and losses, and it protects us against all the claims. And then, like Don mentioned, we also ask the applicants to submit insurance certificates. So we have that on the file. And then, like everyone mentioned, the contract with the customer is between the installer and the customer. So that is not something that we sign with the customer. We make sure that that's an arrangement and an agreement that's between the customer and the installer.
Thanks. So Christian, do you want to maybe ask your question? I could ask it for you, but if you want to unmute, that might be easier.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. I was just curious if in the samples that you gave earlier, one of the contractors was offering energy efficiency, and the City of Santa Fe's Solarize campaign is contemplating kind of really pairing PV installations with energy efficiency. And so I was wondering if you had any, if any of these experts had any experience of an organization or community that was kind of doing the two parallel tracks, and if so, would they run through the same process that that we're looking at for PV installers for energy efficiency contractors as well?
I know, Linda, you do Energize campaigns. So.
Yeah, we run separate campaigns. I mean, energy efficiency is so varied and squishy and hard to, it's not cookie cutter the way solar can be cookie cutter, but we do run separate campaigns for ductless heat pumps called Energize. And I would be happy to share the RFP that we have for that. I don't have it online, but I'll send it to Shar and you can share that. But we've always worried about pairing or giving customers too much to think about at one time. So we haven't actually paired efficiency and solar, even though it makes total sense. When you're thinking about going solar, let's get you the information and help you make that decision, and then come back next year and think about efficiency. And I know that's backwards, but that's how people are.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I mean, we've just only focused on solar, which is kind of our main focus from on our advocacy side as well. One thing we have experienced, which I think is similar to what you just heard, is that it is overwhelming for people to take multiple steps there, and so we certainly will answer questions and make sure that people are sort of aware of the value of energy efficiency. But the way that we kind of think about it, just because people like solar and it sort of connects with them a little bit more sometimes, is from our perspective, we just want everybody to get to the party. I don't really care what door they go through. And it's oftentimes people who go through the solar door end up, doing energy efficiency later and vice versa. So I don't think we shouldn't, definitely don't view it as like an either or one is sort of precluding the other, because we find that when people pay attention to their energy, regardless of for what reason, they end up doing those other things either in sequence afterwards, oftentimes.
That we have looked at doing Solarize type programs for energy efficiency, Christopher, but it really is hard. Like Linda had mentioned, it's a whole different kettle of fish, as they say. But that said, we do ask the contractors in the RFP to bring any energy efficiency products and services that they can to the table, particularly with the LMI and portion of the campaigns, because often you'll find low-income housing, sometimes they're older and in disrepair. So to be able to bring that energy efficiency portion to the table for LMI is really important, so we can try to address both of those. And so as it pertains to the RFP, quite often solar providers do not offer energy efficiency products and services, or if they do, they're very limited. So we'll ask that they, if they have a subcontractor relationship with an energy efficiency provider, then we'll want to know who that is, and we'll also want to see what that agreement is between the solar contractor and the energy efficiency contractor ahead of time. And that's just based on experience from previous campaigns. When you don't have everything buttoned down at the beginning of the campaign, then it can really increase the chances of there being problems later on. So even though we might not have any energy efficiency projects right away, we want to see what that agreement is, and just make sure that the parties have come to an agreement, so we don't run into any problems later on.
And just a quick note that I put in the chat that if helpful, our template for the RFP and the RFP response form do ask about additional offerings like energy efficiency, because it never hurts to ask a question in the RFP. If everyone's answer is no, then but it doesn't hurt to ask, because there are installers out there that do both.
Cool. So also there's a question from, and just echoing what Linda said, well, we can definitely send that RFP along to everyone. But there's a question from Anna. Anna, do you want to unmute yourself and ask that? And I guess, we're kind of nearing the end of our discussion time, but if other folks have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we can get back to you. But yeah, Anna, if you want to unmute yourself and ask that question.
Sure. I'm wondering if when selecting a committee or having a selection committee, if anyone's ever compensated those members for their time. I know I've heard that there's a lot of time and commitment involved in that process, and if you're including members of the community, especially if you're trying to include representatives of traditionally marginalized communities, if that's a consideration, and if so, what are the implications, maybe the legal implications there as well. Yeah, that's my question.
That's a really great practice, and it's something that we haven't put into practice, although we've considered it. And here's some things we've considered. Could you provide reduce barriers in other ways, like provide food, provide childcare, or nowadays have all your meetings by Zoom for first up, because it's so much easier. There's fewer barriers to participation. And then when it comes to compensating, it's a little bit, would we do a stipend for an individual, or would we rather give a stipend to an organization that might then have one of their staff members? So, if there's a real grassroots organization, you might consider what's the local chapter, of some, advocacy or some local organization that might be able to put some staff time toward it if they had funding.
And we haven't done it either, but I love the idea, and certainly I'm actually going to circulate it internally as a way we could do that. There's probably some logistics of pulling it off. One thing we have done is just covering transportation costs before, the pandemic, for in certain situations. We've offered that to people to make a meeting in the evening, or pay for a taxi ride or something if they need to, but that's obviously pretty limited.
I was just wondering if anybody has looked to include indemnification language directly in the contract between the contractor and the homeowner that says they hold the city or the convening organization harmless. Has anybody done that?
We've asked the contractors to put that in, but I actually can't vouch for whether they have done it. But I'll look and see if I can find that.
Thank you.
We have not done that either. I think probably it's a good thought, Christopher. Something I'm going to jot down as well. I think sometimes the idea of just including something like that in the customer agreement, you know, you're kind of bringing these third parties into that agreement, even though you're intending to indemnify them. But by trying to do that, you're kind of bringing them in at the same time. So there's some probably pros and cons to doing it that way. I'd have to look at the issue a little bit further.
For next steps for our cohort, definitely as people have put in the chat, so determine those selection committees, I think has been something that's very common across campaigns, but also develop those RFP evaluation materials. So feel free to use the template that we've created and modify it in any way, as well as, you know, finish drafting that and issuing the RFP if you have not done that yet. The second thing I wanted to remind people about is the opportunity for an honorarium that RMI can provide frontline community organizations that are participating not only in these workshops, but the broader campaign, to help compensate them for their time. And part of that can be for the selection committee as well, if what that frontline organization is doing is partly being on the selection committee. So follow up with me if you have any questions about that. And lastly, RSVP for our last and final workshop. So workshop number 8 is going to be March 24th at this time, same time 3 weeks from today. And it's really going to be preparing for the campaign launch. So our last workshop's really going to be sending you all off with the necessary materials and information to really launch your campaigns. And as I said at the beginning of this workshop, April, May, and June, and the latter months will be more informal office hours, but no official workshops after our last one on March 24th. So with that, we ended a minute early, so I'll give that all back to you, but we'll stay on for an additional 30 minutes with the RMI WR team if you have any questions. But thank you for attending, and hope this workshop was helpful.